Okay, let's see. Are we live? Is the main question currently. Maybe. Maybe not. I think we are. Okay, you guys are going to have to forgive me for being a little bit late today. I didn't realize how strange this weekend was until I started looking back over it today. Very strange stuff going on. I mean, now on Rumble and YouTube. Let's discuss. So yeah, I hope you guys can forgive me for being a little late today. 5 minutes late, actually like 6 or 7, but is this thing gonna work now? Okay, there we go. Alright. I'm still getting my post out. It's gonna be another long episode today. I do feel like double noise. Paste. What is that squeak? Is it this? What a strange weekend joining on Rumble and YouTube. Let's discuss. Post. Okay, that post is out. I hope everybody had a good weekend. I did, at least. It was, rather interesting. I went skateboarding for the first time in a long time. Fell a lot. So that is what it is. Let's see. Okay, let's go to the main cam and let's get this thing started. So today is Monday, January 12th, 2026. This is episode number 34 of Addressing the Issues. So, for, I guess, our main story today, the protests, I would call them riots, continued in U.S. cities over the weekend. These were organized and funded by groups like 5501 and Indivisible. It's weird that these people only say indivisible when it relates to the protests, as it is part of the Pledge of Allegiance. And it's because they refuse to say the Pledge of Allegiance to the United States of America, which is strange. Nevertheless, the winter of love continued with destruction to both public and private property over the weekend. There were multiple instances of this, breaking in the buildings, attempting to destroy vehicles, stuff like that. And this is exactly what the Democrats want these days. Randy Fine, like a day calendar and an abandoned home, he's right once a year, claimed that after 1860, when Democrats created the first Civil War, Tim Walz seems to be calling for the second one. It's bad when right from wrong is easily distinguished by Randy Fine, the same man who celebrated starving children and dead babies in Gaza. Rather horrible claims, horrible things to support. But it's bad when he's right on this. That's absurd. So, they set up these networks, 5501, Indivisible, which are shadily funded NGOs, which work as the organizing parties. We've seen these since Ferguson in 2014, Trayvon Martin in 2013. But these groups have become better organized and have resulted to the Astroturfed campaigns around the death of George Floyd in 2020, also in Minneapolis, And the No Kings protest last year, in which they tried it again to get these protests kicked off, with the murder of 2 Minnesota lawmakers in the morning of the protest, the planned protest. However, when the perpetrator was found with No Kings flyers in his car and admitted his connection to Tim Walz later on, it was obviously too astroturfed for an actual riot to take place then. But all they wanted was the spark to set off the powder keg one more time, and the death of the woman attempting to ram ICE agents was an event in which they could pull the trigger and roll out these NGO machines. By machines, these are the NGOs, groups like 5501, Indivisible, and such. We discussed this on Friday. And once they have the groundworks for what is currently, I would call, a low-grade civil war, and cronies like Tim Walz, Governor Tim Walz, and cronies like Mayor Jacob Frey to play the role of quote-unquote leaders in this movement, that's why, their calls to kill ICE and arrest federal law enforcement should be concerning to you. This systematic rejection of federal government is something that we've seen Democrats do before. We've seen them do it before in 1860 at Fort Sumter, and it led to the deadliest war for Americans in world history. That had resulted in over 2 times the dead Americans than that of World War II. And they will say, oh, well, the parties flipped at some point. So it's obviously the Republicans who are the people who started the Civil War, which is false on so many levels. I would argue back, the Democratic plantation, the Southern Democratic plantation just changed forms. It went from holding people down through chattel slavery and sharecropping to holding people down through dependency of the federal government and erosion of the nuclear family. But there was one protest this weekend on the entire planet, it seems, to be grassroots. And in all places, it was in Pacific Palisades, California. I also would say maybe those in Argentina. I'd have to do some more research on that one because that is a newer one. But in Argentina, protesters are taking to the streets over the change in wildfire land acquisition laws and the potentially nefarious reasons on how the wildfires were started. I'm not going to give an opinion on this until I can look further into it, but at the initial surface level, it seems that these people may have every right to be upset. But I'm going to focus on Pacific Palisades today, where people took to the streets on the 1-year anniversary of their community being burned down. The people there sought justice, the removal of red tape preventing them from being able to rebuild their homes on their property in the wake of a disaster. A year later, 14% of the homes destroyed in the fire have received permits to rebuild, meaning 86% haven't. Over 86% of the people who used to live there have not been able to rebuild their homes. These protests called out politicians like Mayor Karen Bass and Governor Gavin Newsom for slow-walking the recovery process, leaving these people without their homes. 1 year later, I do still wonder why the reservoirs were drained during the dry season. Doesn't seem like the smartest plan, and why people were told winds were too high to fly aircraft to put out the fires when the actual wind speeds were less than half of what was claimed at the time, and why these people's homes were burned at such a disproportionate rate, and which should have happened, and why now a year later cleanup is totally stalled and these people are still not allowed to rebuild their homes. It makes me wonder if the 15 minutes city theory has a little bit of truth to it. And maybe the $24 billion in homeless spending in the state of California would be better spent on this homeless population who do want to come back to their community, and they do want their community to flourish. I guess we are yet to see if these grievances will be addressed by California and Los Angeles officials. Most people would hope so. These people do not deserve to be homeless over neglect from the government, and certainly not the government holding them back from rebuilding due to their own neglect. But we will move on to an update on the Iran protests and how my opinion has shifted somewhat over the weekend. With the protests in Iran, the internet blackout going on 96 hours now, and approximations of over 1,000 people dead. This seems to be counterintuitive, unless the people of Iran really want to rebuild an entire country from rubble, burned cars, destroyed buildings. These are things that are not easily and quickly flipped around into a burgeoning society like which Iran had going into the 1970s. It would not have beaches lined with tourists in bikinis again if the majority of the country is a war-torn wasteland. So I posit who would be the beneficiaries of an absolutely decimated Iran. It certainly won't be Europe or the US, with diminished access to crude oil and the high probability of a refugee crisis, which once again they will feel the need to burden. But it's likely a much closer country to Iran, with a vested interest in destroying it and the proxies in the region in which it funds. Not only this, but seeing the damage it has caused to children, with a 3-year-old being shot by protesters, mosques sheltering children being firebombed. Yes, there's a video making the rounds of a Molotov exploding at the feet of multiple children. I would ask, what do the children have to do with your qualms with the regime? What does a 3-year-old girl have to do with it? These children obviously are not making the decisions. I don't know why they have to pay the price for the decisions the regime has made. So that's why my opinion on this has changed a little bit. I hope it does turn out well in Iran, but I also don't see how this level of instability benefits the next governing body at all. They will be cleaning up the pieces from whatever's happened over the last week or so. And from what will they do with it from there? Will they be able to make an Iran that is of 1970s prosperity with absolutely nothing? I fear probably not. I fear that it's going to be even more so of a failed state than we're already experiencing with Iran, with poverty and such. I think it can only get worse, and that's why we will see likely another refugee crisis, that at some point the US and Europe will feel the need to burden, which is probably not in either of our best interests given what's going on currently with refugee crises in both the United States, Europe, I guess Canada as well. You could probably throw Australia into that mix. That's why I say most of the protests this weekend seem to be more astroturfed than grassroots. Like I said, the only grassroots one I could surely identify as being a grassroots protest was Pacific Palisades. They were upset that they don't have homes where they lived a year out. They're upset that they couldn't rebuild. Like I said, maybe Argentina. I'll have to look into that one. But all the other ones, also Pacific Palisades being the one grassroots protest, wasn't violent, believe it or not. Maybe that's a surprise. But all these astroturfed ones, such as in Minneapolis, such as what I believe to be astroturfed in Iran, are violent. Very, very violent. Destruction of people, property, business, private and public property. And I guess that is probably the hallmarks of an astroturfed protest. It is a riot. It is meant to incite violence. But that's where we are right now with that. Today, in other news, I guess I should say, today federal prosecutors opened a formal investigation into the chair of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, centering on renovations of the Federal Reserve's headquarters in Washington, D.C. Jerome Powell is under criminal investigation over the central bank's renovation and whether he lied to Congress about the scope of the project. The investigation includes Powell's public statements and examination of spending records related to the project. Powell's current term as chair of the Fed ends in May, and President Trump has already decided on who he plans to replace the Fed chair, with it likely being Kevin Hassett. We've been told he's decided who it will be. We haven't been told who. But the common belief is that it will be Kevin Hassett to lead the chair of the Federal Reserve. While seeing Jerome Powell in cuffs would be nice, I do want to see the abolishment of the Fed, particularly because I simply don't see the Department of Justice being successful on any case in the near future, as they have been very ineffective on every single one in the last year, to the point it's almost a joke. That would be Pam Bondi's Department of Justice. But, going back to the Civil War claims that I made earlier in the episode, President Lincoln decided that opposed to allowing the Fed to control debt during the Civil War, and therefore interest, he issued the greenback, in which the United States government would control interest on accrued war debt, as opposed to the private entity, which is the Federal Reserve. Shortly after this proclamation, he was shot by John Wilkes Booth, which the Ontario Bank had a $455 getaway fund for, which Booth obviously never used because he was caught. Obviously, this happened after the culmination of the war, but still the bank cartel is apparently not somebody you want to fight against. The moral of the story is just never fight against the bank cartel, in which Trump actually just did over the weekend. So over the weekend, President Trump proposed a 10% interest cap on credit cards. On January 20th, the 10% cap would remain in effect for 1 year, warning that non-compliant creditors would face very severe things. The current average interest on credit card debt averages between 20 and 22%. But President Trump seems to be fighting back at the banking cartel on multiple fronts. This echoes sentiments of the public that the banks are guilty of usury by charging these exorbitant interest rates. However, those with money, particularly banks, have come out against the change, with claims that they would be operating at a loss or would be unable to provide people with lines of credit. My argument to that would be maybe they should have taken that into account before they decided to creep interest rates up into the 20% range, making it almost impossible for average citizens to pay off debt once interest started to hit. I think it would be probably more responsible to not lend out lines of credit to people that aren't going to be able to pay it back, not attack people who want reasonable interest rates for people that are indebted. It's wrong. It's been wrong for thousands of years now, but I digress. We'll be moving into the next topic, which I addressed a little bit, I guess, in a sense, in the closing on Friday. in particular, which was about hypersonic missiles. But apparently the U.S. has some new technology that had its first use on the raid in Venezuela. An interesting account of the raid of Venezuela was released over the weekend from allegedly what was a security guard of the regime. It's hard to verify who was Maduro's security these days, obviously, but the translated conversation released to the public was as follows. The security guard says, "On the day of the operation, we didn't hear anything coming. We were on guard, but suddenly all our radar systems shut down without any explanation. The next thing we saw were drones, a lot of drones flying over our positions. We didn't know how to react." The interviewer asks, "So what happened next? How was the main attack?" The security guard responds, "After those drones appeared, some helicopters arrived, but there were very few. I think barely 8 helicopters. From those helicopters, soldiers came down, but a very small number. Maybe 20 men, but those men were technologically very advanced. They didn't look like anything we've fought against before." The interviewer asks, "And the battle began?" The security guard responds, "Yes, but it was a massacre. We were hundreds, but we had no chance. They were shooting with such precision and speed, it seemed like each soldier was firing 300 rounds per minute. We couldn't do anything." The interviewer asks, "And your weapons, didn't they help?" The security guard responds, "No help at all, because it wasn't just the weapons. At one point, they launched something. I don't know how to describe it. It was like a very intense sound wave. Suddenly, I felt like my head was exploding from the inside. We all started to bleed from the nose. Some were vomiting blood. We fell to the ground, unable to move." The interviewer asks, and your comrades, did they manage to resist?" The security guard states, "No, not at all. Those 20 men without a single casualty killed hundreds of us. We had no way to compete with their technology, with their weapons. I swear I've never seen anything like it. We couldn't even stand up after that sonic weapon or whatever it was." The interviewer says, "So do you think the rest of the region should think twice before confronting the Americans?" The security guard responds, "Without a doubt. I'm sending a warning to everyone who thinks they can fight the United States. They have no idea what they're capable of. After what I saw, I never want to be on the other side of that again. They're not to be messed with." The interviewer asks, "And now that Trump has said Mexico is on the list, do you think the situation will change in Latin America?" The security guard says, "Definitely. Everyone is talking about this. No one wants to go through what we went through. Now everyone thinks twice. What happened here is going to change a lot of things, not just in Venezuela, but throughout the region." So in this raid, allegedly, hundreds were killed by roughly 20 U.S. soldiers, including 32 Cuban special operators. I guess we'll talk about the weapons that are used. Apparently a sonic weapon capable of incapacitating hundreds. And I guess the less mentioned idea that you could get 300 on-target shots a minute is quite an absurd claim, meaning that there's likely something, we don't really know about yet. I digress, though. In this raid, allegedly hundreds were killed by roughly 20 U.S. soldiers, including 32 Cuban special operators. This is interesting because to have 32 foreign nationals as part of the security force of a president of a different country certainly means something. Particularly Cuba, which was the arm of the USSR into Latin America, which is now being used by Russia and China. This is the same structure that was used in Nicaragua, a place I've been before, with the Sandinistas and Manuel Noriega in Panama. Now that the operation has grown to using doctors from the Latin America School of Medicine, this is the exportation of the Cuban Socialist Revolution. They start with doctors as a positive relationship builder, and then it slowly evolves into spies and militants, which obviously send information back to Cuba on how and when to push for socialist revolutions in these other Latin American countries. They start with doctors as a positive relationship builder, and then it slowly evolves into spies and militants, which will send information back into Cuba. And after that, you do get your socialist revolution. They have the timing, they have the resources, but they do this in conjunction with other socialist states such as China and Russia, like what we're seeing in Mexico today, a cartel that pushes Chinese-made drugs, namely the precursors to fentanyl, are all manufactured in China. And then they push these drugs into the U.S. while propping up a socialist leader, such as the current president of Mexico, Gloria Sheinbaum. Obviously, it's not what the people want, but it's what they get anyways, hence the recent riots at the capital in Mexico. This is the goal of undermining the United States in our own hemisphere. You know, you can think of the Cuban Five who came to the U.S. as exiles and worked as spies. You can think of Ana Montes, who is a senior analyst for the Defense Intelligence Agency. And you can think of Manuel Roca, who was working as a U.S. diplomat and a Cuban spy. You know, the plan is they come here and quote-unquote denounce the Cuban regime. They pledge their loyalty to the United States. They know it's not real. The U.S. doesn't. Havana knows it's not real. The spies know it's not real. But the only people that think it is real is the United States. The United States, which welcomes them with open arms into the most fragile areas of the government sometimes. You know, in these cases, military, defense intelligence, and diplomacy. And this is why the starving of Cuba from Venezuelan oil is so crucial, you know, as they are the intelligence arm of this socialist system, and narco states such as Colombia and Mexico are the muscle, while Venezuelan oil provides the majority of the funding. But this is, you know, a systemic operation to undermine the United States, and likely why President Trump is taking such overt actions, as in the grand scheme of things, these are existential to our society and democracy. This has been happening since the USSR, and it continues to happen today. But this is likely why the U.S. would use such overwhelming force to prove its point in just one raid, using weapons that are apparently classified, weapons we haven't seen before, but to prove that the U.S. will still control its backyard, and to scare politicians such as that of the president of Colombia, who in a matter of days went from come and get me to we will be working with the U.S. And also, this isn't the only time that weapons such as these have been used in the region. The U.S. tried to make relations with Cuba regular in the past during the Obama administration, and the diplomat stationed there reportedly suffered from Havana syndrome, which was likely a Russian USSR era directed energy weapon, which caused ringing of the ears, confusion, instability, loss of balance, things such as this, and allegedly it's still uncurable. It wouldn't be the first time weapons like these have been used, and obviously this was to prove a point. It's obviously proving a point to somebody. I guess the president of Colombia is understanding. I don't know if the president of Mexico will change her mind. But it is on par with weapons such as the Havana syndrome weapon, which was used against U.S. soldiers. The U.S. is now using allegedly acoustic weapons to get back at, in a way, Cuba. with their 32 special operators on security detail there. Obviously, we'll see in the future how effective this was, at least uncontrolled. We try to control it, but it always ends up uncontrolled. But there's also people that are, frustrated with these socialist systems in which everybody is starved, oppressed, stuff like this. But we will, soon find out the results of how all this will go down. We'll figure out if people do get the message, if they don't, if it was effective or not. I guess we'll just have to wait and find out how all this plays out. But it does seem like this was intended to send a message to Latin America that this is the U.S.'s backyard, and we don't want the arms of the Chinese, the arms of Russia, contributing to intelligence missions, narco-terrorism missions, stuff like this. But like I said, we'll just have to see how all that plays out. That's really all I have for today. I checked earlier, and nobody guessed that Indiana was going to win the football game. Absolutely stomped Miami. So there will be no free shout-outs today, guys. Unfortunate. But like I said, that's all we have for today. Make sure you guys are dropping a like on this, subscribing on YouTube, following on Rumble. Share this one. I know this is a little bit more of a pundit style, theoretical style of episode today, but that's why this weekend was so weird. You had these Astroturfed protests and all across the world. You have a president going after the Federal Reserve. Like I discussed, the last person to do that was Abraham Lincoln, and he was shot by a dude with a getaway fund from the Ontario Bank. And then there is obviously the Donroe Doctrine, as it is eloquently now called in Latin America, that is firmly establishing that it is our backyard and we will not be undermined by socialist Chinese and socialist Russian influences in the region. There's also obviously the Iran thing, which looks to be more and more astroturfed. Minnesota, obviously astroturfed. They were just waiting on that powder keg to have the fuse lit, and the fuse was lit, and now we get a winter of love. That's all I have for today. I'd really appreciate if you guys would share. The thing I appreciate most is obviously you guys watching every day. Sorry I was late, but hopefully it won't happen again tomorrow. There's just a lot of things to cover, a lot of things to look at, a lot of things to research. Just given the gravity of what's currently going on in the world, along within the U.S. So hopefully, soon things will slow down a little bit, make my job a little bit easier. We'll still have things to cover. Maybe we could cover football or something fun. Got the football out because it is playoff time. Figured it was a suiting prop or suiting background for what's going on. At least at home, it is that time of the year. Playoffs, I love it. It's a great weekend of playoffs. But like I said, that's all I have for today. Hopefully I can talk about fun things like that soon. But until then, we'll be covering things that have much more meaning, like what's going on in the world as tensions rise, and not only nationally, but internationally. We'll keep covering this stuff, and maybe one day it'll slow down enough we can talk about NFL playoffs or college football playoffs a little bit more, but because that's something I do like to talk about. But once again, guys, I appreciate you guys viewing. That's the most important thing. But if you drop a like, subscribe, turn on notifications, share, I'd appreciate all that a lot as well. So I guess I'll sign off here. I'll catch you guys again at 4:45 tomorrow Eastern time. To all my people on the East Coast, I hope you get home safe. To my people further west, I hope you finish up the workday strong and get home safe as well. Thank you guys for joining me, and I will